Dust curled along the main street like smoke from some invisible fire, stirred by the wheels of the mail wagon as it rattled to a stop before the saloon. Evening light had begun its slow descent, softening the wooden facades of storefronts, painting gold across the windows, and stretching shadows long across the road. The air was filled with the scrape of boots against the boardwalk and the distant whinny of restless horses tied to the hitching rails. Every eye turned toward the wagon door, waiting to see the woman who had traveled so far under the title of bride. When she stepped down, the hush was heavier than a church prayer. Clara Mae Thompson was not what the crowd expected, and their disappointment slid sharp across her skin like a blade. She was a large woman, her figure pressed against the seams of a modest blue dress, her face flushed from the long journey and the weight of eyes that would not look away. She adjusted her bonnet with trembling fingers, though the gesture did little to hide the fullness of her cheeks, the roundness of her shoulders, or the heaviness she carried with each breath. A woman of her size drew whispers, and in this town, whispers cut deeper than stones. "Lord, she's a wagon all her own," someone muttered from the porch of the general store. A chorus of laughter answered, rough and careless, spilling out like spilt liquor. Clara heard each word though she did not raise her eyes. Her boots pressed against the planks, each step groaning beneath her, yet she kept walking, chin lowered but forward still. The locket at her throat, the last gift of her mother, knocked gently against her chest. Its rhythm reminded her of why she had come. A letter promising a home, a man in need of a wife, and the faint, fragile dream of belonging. From the edge of the crowd, Silas McGraw stood silent. Tall, shoulders broad from years of ranch work, his face carried the solemn shade of a man who had seen too much loss. The brim of his hat shadowed his eyes, though nothing could disguise the sharp line of his jaw or the sadness etched into the corners of his mouth. He was a widower of 3 years, raising a daughter too young to remember her mother's embrace. Out of necessity, not yearning, he had written for a bride. Now, looking at the woman stepping toward him through laughter and cruel glances, he felt something inside him buckle. Not revulsion, not disgust, something smaller, more complicated. Shame that he did not know how to shield her, shame that he cared too much for the opinion of neighbors already measuring him with mocking eyes. Clara stopped before him, breath shallow. Their eyes met, if only for a flicker. She found no cruelty in his gaze, but neither did she find warmth. His lips pressed into a line, his voice little more than a whisper carried on dust. Clara Mae. Her name in his mouth sounded like a question rather than a welcome. The crowd lingered, feeding on silence. A ranch wife with a sharp tongue let out a laugh that cracked the stillness. McGraw's mighty desperate. Another added, that poor child of his, imagine calling this one mother. More laughter, harsh, pointed, echoing in Clara's bones. Silas's jaw clenched, but his hands remained at his sides, fists closed, yet unmoving. He gave the townsfolk nothing, and that nothing struck Clara harder than any cruel word. She had hoped for a defender, someone to meet the scorn with strength. Instead, she was left standing exposed, her humiliation plain for all. The wagon driver lifted her small trunk, setting it beside her with a thud. Dust swirled up in a circle, a cloud of earth that seemed to rise and hang around her as though the land itself marked her apart. She placed her gloved hand atop the trunk and whispered, "Thank you," though her voice was nearly drowned by another round of murmurs. Silas cleared his throat. "We'll ride out." That was all. No kind assurance, no gesture of welcome. He picked up the trunk as though it weighed no more than air and nodded toward the wagon that would carry them home. Clara followed, each step slower, heavier, her heart beating against the locket that now felt less like comfort and more like a chain. The ride was long, the wheels groaning over ruts and stones, the prairie stretching endless in its silence. The air smelled of dust, sunburnt grass, and the faint sweetness of distant sage. Clara sat on the wooden bench beside Silas, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She dared not speak, dared not break the stillness that seemed to weigh even heavier than the wagon itself. His daughter sat nestled beside him, a girl no older than 7, with hair the color of wheat and eyes wide and unblinking. She watched Clara, studying her without cruelty, without mirth, simply searching. The child's silence felt kinder than her father's clipped words about fences that needed mending, chickens that needed tending, chores that would not wait for new hands to grow accustomed. Clara's thoughts drifted back to the town. The laughter had not faded. It echoed still, biting into her resolve. She replayed each word, each sneer, until her chest ached. But deeper than shame was a hollow kind of longing. She wanted so desperately to belong, to prove herself more than their cruel names. She wondered if Silas's daughter looked at her with fear or with hope. She wondered what Silas himself saw when he dared a glance her way. The land rolled out in gold and shadow as the sun dipped lower. Fences appeared, a weathered barn, the outline of a house standing lonely against the sky. This was to be her new life, a place that might either break her or save her. The wagon creaked to a halt, and Silas set her trunk on the porch without a word. He guided his daughter inside, leaving Clara standing alone in the deepening twilight. She stepped into the house moments later, greeted by the smell of wood smoke and the silence of rooms too large for 2 people. A guest room had been prepared for her, a bed covered in a quilt, a pitcher of water waiting on the washstand. She closed the door softly behind her, the quiet pressing in until it became unbearable. She sat on the edge of the bed, fingers clasping the locket. She whispered into the dimness, voice breaking with exhaustion and sorrow, "Maybe they were right. Maybe I was a fool to come." Tears burned hot trails down her cheeks, though she wiped them quickly, ashamed even in solitude. From the hallway came the faintest sound, the small pad of footsteps, hesitant, curious. Clara lifted her head, heart tightening. The steps paused outside her door, lingered as though someone stood listening. Then silence returned, but not the same silence. This one carried with it a question, a possibility unspoken. She lay back against the quilt, holding her locket tight, staring into the shadows as the prairie wind pressed against the house like a sigh. Though loneliness still weighed heavy, something softer stirred beneath it, fragile, tentative, not yet nameable. And with that stir, the night deepened, promising both trial and revelation yet to come. The morning broke soft over the prairie, a wash of pale light spilling across the horizon, gilding the frost-tipped grass and painting the ranch house in hues of gold. Clara Mae rose before the rooster's call, her sleep thin and restless, her body aching from the long days of travel and the heavier ache of humiliation. She tied her hair back, smoothed her plain dress, and stepped into the yard where the chill clung sharp against her skin. The land spread wide and silent before her, and in that stillness she resolved to move, to work, to prove that she was more than the whispers she carried like scars. She began with the chickens, clumsy at first, her large hands trembling as she fumbled with feed, scattering too much in one place, startling the hens into a frantic flutter. The air filled with feathers and cackles, yet she persisted, steadying her breath until the creatures calmed. Her skirts brushed against the damp earth, her boots sinking into the softened ground. Sweat gathered despite the cold, sliding down her temples. She bent to her work, her broad frame bending and lifting with determination, each motion weighted but purposeful. She had not come to be idle, nor to give the town fresh cause for scorn. From the porch, Silas watched. His hat rested low, shadowing his eyes, yet nothing escaped his gaze. He noted the way she strained, the way her body moved with awkwardness but also resolve. There was no grace in her labor, but there was grit. He admired it in silence, though the silence itself was another wall between them. He did not praise, nor offer guidance, only turned when she glanced his way, leaving her with the sting of being unacknowledged. The townsfolk did not leave them in peace. Neighbors rode by, leaning from their saddles with knowing smirks, offering words dipped in false cheer but sharpened beneath. "Morning, McGraw. That new wife of yours working out? Takes a strong barn to house such a load." Laughter spurred their horses forward, leaving dust in their wake. Silas's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his silence a blade Clara felt keenly. She stood in the yard, hands smudged with dirt, face burning hotter than the sun that had not yet risen high. On Sunday they went to church. Clara had pressed her dress as best she could, but the fabric pulled tight at her waist, refusing to flatter, refusing to hide. She walked beside Silas, their steps in rhythm yet their bodies apart, his daughter trotting between them with her small hand clasped in his. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of candle wax and wood polish, the pews filled with faces that turned toward her with curiosity first, then ridicule. The women in bonnets whispered behind gloved hands, their mouths bent in cruel amusement. One voice rose just loud enough, "Poor man couldn't do better?" Another chimed, "Imagine that child calling her mother." Clara's cheeks flamed, her heart galloped. She lowered herself into the pew, wishing the wood might swallow her whole. Her throat tightened against tears, but she would not let them fall here, not among wolves who would savor every drop. She clasped her locket instead, pressing her mother's memory against the hollow in her chest. Silas heard it all. He sat stiff, shoulders like stone, hands folded hard on his knees. His pride warred with his shame, his silence the only weapon he seemed able to wield. Yet his silence was no shield for Clara. It was abandonment, raw and cold. When the service ended, she rose quickly, desperate for the open air. Her steps quickened, her breath sharp, until she nearly fled the church door. It was Annie who stopped her. The child ran forward, clutching at Clara's skirts with small hands. Clara froze, startled, lowering her gaze to the girl who looked up at her with eyes the color of summer skies. Annie's voice rang clear, bright as a bell, cutting through the whispers still buzzing in the air. "She is pretty, Daddy." The words hung there, a fragile truth in a room filled with venom. The congregation stilled, their smirks faltering. Silas's breath caught as though the child had struck him. In her innocent declaration, the world shifted. He looked at Clara then, not as the town had painted her, not as his own guarded pride had framed her, but as his daughter saw her. Not grotesque, not pitiful. Simply a woman worthy of love, of gentleness, of belonging. That night, Clara found herself by the hay barn, the moonlight spilling silver across the land, the cool air smelling of dust and clover. She sat alone, tears dried stiff on her cheeks, her hands folded tight in her lap. She had thought to hide her hurt there, away from sight, but Silas came. His boots crunched softly against the earth, his shadow long and uncertain. He stopped before her, his hat in hand, his face bare to the night. "I should have spoken," he said, voice low, rough with regret. "I should have stood with you." She said nothing, only turned her gaze aside, the silence heavy with what had already been lost. He knelt then, lowering himself so his eyes met hers. In his rough palm he held a folded scrap of paper. He pressed it into her hand, and when she opened it, she found a child's drawing, 3 figures, hand in hand, beneath a sun scribbled bright. Annie's letters, clumsy but proud, spelled Ma. "She sees what I was too blind to," Silas murmured. "You're already hers. And maybe mine too, if you'll let me." His words were not many, but they carried the weight of truth, of a man humbled at last. Clara's throat tightened, tears threatening again, but these were different, softer, trembling with possibility. She did not answer with words. Instead, she let his hand cover hers, let it remain there, roughness against softness, the warmth of it lingering long. For the first time since she had stepped from that wagon, she did not feel alone. Weeks later, they rode into town again. The wagon wheels stirred dust as before, the townsfolk watching with eyes still sharp, tongues still eager. But this time Silas held Clara's hand openly, his thumb brushing over her knuckles, steady, unashamed. Annie nestled against Clara's side, her smile bright and fearless. Together they looked less like a man desperate and a woman mocked, and more like a family carved out of resilience and quiet grace. The whispers came, but they fell short, unable to pierce the dignity of the sight before them. The image burned itself into memory. 3 souls bound not by appearance or by the fickle approval of a town, but by the tender courage of a child and the slow, stubborn growth of love. And to any who watched closely enough, it was clear. The laughter that had once sought to undo Clara Mae now rang hollow, powerless. For in the hush of that dusty street, she was no longer the subject of ridicule. She was a woman seen, chosen, and held.